Hello, Judge and Opponent. Today I will be arguing for the affirmative to the resolution that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. I would first like to stress the wording of the resolution. The word ought implies a moral obligation for the subject to perform the action in question, which is, in this case, paying reparations. However, I do acknowledge that the word reparation is much too vague, so to debate effectively, I would like to advocate specifically for reparations in the form of reduced mortgage rates on homes for African Americans. The purpose of this speech will be to explain how this form of reparations will fulfill the moral obligations of the federal government and why it is actually a befitting repayment to African Americans for the harms that were done to them. To establish the country's moral obligations, I will prove that it benefited from its use of slave labor and that the institution of slavery disadvantaged the African American population as a whole. For the 245 years from 1620 to 1865, the United States federal government actively participated and profited from the institutionalized enslavement of the entire African American race. Slave labor during this time accounted for a majority of the United States economic production and paid for a large portion of the government's expenses. The following is a quote from an article from the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. In the pre-Civil War United States, a stronger case can be made that slavery played a critical role in economic development. One crop, slave-grown cotton, provided over half of all U.S. export earnings. By 1840, the South grew 60% of the world's cotton and provided some 70% of cotton consumed by the British textile industry. Thus, slavery paid for a substantial share of the capital, iron, and manufactured good that laid the basis for the American economic growth. In addition, precisely because the South specialized in cotton production, the North developed a variety of businesses that provided services for the slave South, including textile factories, a meat processing industry, insurance companies, shippers, and cotton brokers. This proves that America was built on slave labor and continues to reap the benefits to this very day. It's clear to see the negative effects that slavery directly had on the African American slaves themselves, but the indirect effects of slavery that took place after it was abolished are really responsible for the current socioeconomic standing of African Americans in this country. And this is where reparations in the form of reduced mortgage rates applies. After slavery was abolished, African Americans faced another near century of discrimination and prejudice in the form of Jim Crow laws that were passed by the U.S. government. One law in particular, the 1934 National Housing Act, ended up having a devastating effect to the future advancement of the African American population. The 1934 National Housing Act was a piece of legislation that outlined black neighborhoods as credit risks, making those homes significantly undervalued. In addition, banks would often participate in a practice known as racial steering, which forced black families into subprime mortgages with high interest rates, while at the same time providing white families with similar credit favorable mortgages in comparison. Significant effects still remain today in the form of predominantly black neighborhoods that have high poverty rates, lesser home values, and rotting infrastructure. This shouldn't come as a surprise, however, because according to Forbes.com, Wells Fargo admitted to manipulating mortgages via racial steering as recently as 2012. For most families in this country, a home comprises the bulk of their assets, and when we look at homeowner statistics, we see that 75% of white Americans own their own home compared to just 45% of African Americans. This is attributable to past Jim Crow legislature that made it much more difficult for black families to purchase a home and therefore prevented them from growing their wealth through the home's equity. Let me now review the chain of events that I've described to show how reducing mortgage rates for African Americans is a pragmatic and effective way to repay them for the debt that they are owed. The United States government chooses to institutionalize the enslavement of African Americans in 1620. For the next 245 years, the government profits off their labor and lays the foundation for the future of the country without any compensation whatsoever, while at the same time forcing them into horrible, dehumanizing living conditions without adequate food, water, healthcare, or education. Then, after institutionalized slavery is abolished, they are subjected to another century of legal oppression and discrimination via Jim Crow laws. One unforeseen effect of the Jim Crow laws is that black families are unable to grow their wealth at the same rate as white families, putting them at a substantial socioeconomic disadvantage. Therefore, it is clear that the U.S. federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans, and my plan to reduce mortgage rates is desirable not only because it will solve for the harms by allowing African American families to grow their wealth and improve their standing in society, but because it makes up for specific injustice that has direct effect on living victims. Thank you for your time and for a great debate.